This is Marian Bradley Anderson, and this is a lecture for the first year seminar 107, Joker and the Fool. This is Aristophanes and the Lysistrata. And we're here at Western Oregon University. So, Aristophanes is the person who wrote the Lysistrata, and I'm giving you a brief rundown on who he is because it is hard to parse this play without some context. So, Aristophanes was a famous playwright in the 400 BCs in Athens. And some say he's the most creative Greek playwright because, well, Euripides and Sophocles, they wrote the tragedies. They wrote within the world that they lived in. So everything that happened was conceived of as being like literally could happen in their world. Yes, there were. Did they have monsters in some of these plays? They might have, but mostly the tragedies worked with like real people, and the gods sometimes came down. Aristophanes made everything up. He had most of his plays are named after things that the chorus represented. So in one of them, the chorus was all talking frogs. In another one, the chorus was clouds. And so he made stuff up. He made up the rules. It was pretty fun. He made up history, space-time, gravity, physiology. He just had fun with things. Whereas the tragic poets, the tragic playwrights, and poets and playwrights are interchangeable in ancient Greek. The tragic poets were much more interested in things, being like real-ish. So, let's talk a little bit more about comedy and tragedy. We've been talking about comedy this entire term. We haven't talked about it as a counterpart to tragedy or compared it to tragedy. And in general, laughter is more direct and universal than the emotions of tragedy. It's not that tragedy doesn't happen in other cultures. It certainly does. And the fact that we can watch, say, Oedipus Rex or Medea and be upset in a similar way to the way that the Greeks would is testament to the fact that tragedy is universal, but comedy is pretty universal too. It's a little more direct too. But much of comedy, but some comedy, let's see, like a political thriller is hard to understand unless you understand the politics of an era. But you would understand someone slipping on something and falling down. So comic characters also, they walk and talk like normal people, whereas tragic characters are usually nobles or kings, and are above the commoners in the audience. So we did start this class about comedy off with a tragedy with King Lear, and you'll notice that it was about kings and nobles, and the only common people were was the fool, right? Nobody else was common. Whereas in this play, in Lysistrata, everybody is just like middle class, pretty much. I'm going to talk a little bit about types of comedy. Now, we did some exercises before about the different kinds of comedy, and we kind of came to the conclusion that we categorize at our peril. But this is somewhat useful. Sentimental comedy is where we sympathize with the characters. We're like, we want them to do well. We'll still laugh at them, but it's harder to laugh at characters that you care about, right? That's why with sketch comedy, all you need is a stereotype, and then you can understand all you need to know for the joke. Intellectual comedy is based with incongruities. So if you have a well-dressed man, but his hat is all mushed up, that's funny because we don't see it often. It's incongruous. His hat is supposed to be perfect, just like the rest of him, right? Phalluses are funny in this way too, because we just don't see them out in public. And I want to emphasize that the Greeks were rather prudish in their values. And yes, this is the Greeks who were just fine with homosexuality. they were prudish in a lot of their the other ways that they dealt with the world, including female sexuality. But that makes it so that the body humor, BAWDY, was that much funnier. If you think of other cultures that are seen as, I'm trying to think of a nice word for it, prudish. Let's just keep it that. In the English, the Brits are sometimes thought of as being very upper crust and very Victorian in their morals, but they also have Monty Python, and I think Benny Hill was American, but he was popular over there. Their comedy is rather loud and wild, and there's a theory that it's proportional to how strict their morals are. So the Greeks were rather prudish. So Aristophanes wrote for his contemporary audience, just like all authors. It's hard to write for posterity. Most people can't do it on purpose. And Aristophanes was not writing for posterity on purpose. He was writing for his period. And so he wrote political humor, and he was roasting like the entire political body of Athens. But we don't know that, and you wouldn't know that unless you had a degree in the political ups and downs of that particular part of Athenian, that year of Athenian life. It sort of would be like watching Saturday Night Live from 20, 30 years ago. Unless you know something about the politics of that time, you won't understand the jokes. But his physical humor and his jokes are very accessible to us. Those things have remained funny. Big old penises flopping around are funny. Uh, 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 and women trying to sneak off so they can have sex, that's funny. Those things are still funny to the human race. But even so, ironically, his humor, Aristophanes' humor, tends to be intellectual rather than sentimental. Because sentimental humor, you connect with the characters and you want them to do well. These characters are so broadly painted that it's hard to have a connection with any of them. Lysistrata and Marina might be exceptions to that, but even so, they're still kind of broadly painted, and we don't know anything about, like Lysistrata's. We know she has a husband, but he never shows up, so it's hard to connect with them. But everything else is intellectual humor, as in it's not stuff that has to do. It's more has to do with wit and whatnot. But let's talk more about the bodiness. There is a Greek face, and it has comic actors in costumes. And it was painted during the Greek times when they were doing costumes and comic plays. So this is relatively authentic, right? But most Greek plays and literature was fairly clean. It wasn't bawdy at all. But Aristophanes' plays are obscene. All of them make every fart joke and sex joke you want to think about. It's probably in there somewhere. But here's the thing, is that all of these plays were performed at a religious festival that was sanctioned by the state and presided over by a priest, and all the citizens of the town had to go to these plays. It was part of your civic duty. Now, the citizens were all male. They were all, I think, either landowners or otherwise mucky mucks, right? But still, 15,000 of them in a generous-sized town. 15,000 men would all have to go to these theater performances as part of their civic duty. So here's a question: why was it that the government basically made everybody go and watch these plays that they knew were going to be obscene? So why were these dirty plays performed at religious functions? Well, you kind of have to understand religion in ancient Greece, because you've probably encountered the Greek gods. And the Greek gods are really close to human beings. They were petty and sexy and vain, and they exhibited different types of the human psyche, basically. Well, the festival of Dionysus was the wine god, and the city Dionysus is when the contests for both tragedies and comedies were held. And it was a contest for the playwrights, and the winners got like to go on tour, and there was a financial purse and accolades, and Aristophanes won several times for the comedy. So why so obscene though? Well, comedy's origins are in fertility's cults. And so therefore, sex is a natural subject here, because the fertility, not just the fertility of your fields, of your grapevines, of your wheat fields, but also of your marriage. That's why you're supposed to like throw rice at weddings. That's why we have like the horsetails on the man here. They're satyrs. So sex is a natural subject here if you're talking about a fertility rite. Marriage is a natural end to the fertility rite. The end of Lysistrata is frequently staged as a very happy, loving orgy. It's perfect. It's a perfect example of what a fertility rite thing would be. And so these fertility rites would exaggerate. They would pad the costumes of their breasts, the bellies, the phalluses, the butts. All of these things come from these fertility cults. And what's really interesting to me is that this Greek theater is pretty much the first evidence of theater that we have. And by the time they started writing these things down, they already had 4 or 5 acts. They had, this dancing in one direction, the dancing in the other direction while you're singing. By the way, all Greek plays were musicals. They all sang and danced the whole, so they were really highly complex, fully formed things when we first get written copies of them. They obviously did not just like leap forward from the artist's brains in these fully formed forms. So there's a history of theater there that's been lost because nobody bothered to write it down. But anyway, there's a direct line from fertility cults and what we know about them, and we have descriptions of them, to these comic plays. All poets and playwrights were seen as teachers, and Aristophanes took this really seriously. Whereas the tragedians, the tragic poets, the tragic playwrights explored large issues like fate and death and faithfulness. The comics do what comics do. They tell the audience what's wrong. Here we are in a war, and it's costing us money, and our women are lonely, and it's draining our resources, and we don't know what we're fighting for anymore. That's what comics do. They tell you what's wrong, and they invite action, and they do it in a funny way. So airplane food, what's up with that? It's always terrible, right? Why can't they make food on airplanes? It's topical. It's just a topical comic thing. But also, you get, when you're on stage and you're doing a comedy, it's called carnival privilege. It's like going nuts at Mardi Gras. Whatever happens at Mardi Gras stays in Mardi Gras. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? You get on stage in a comedy, and it's always an element of serious comedy that there's a carnival privilege, or that things are wacky on stage that wouldn't be otherwise. So, for example, the women would have a sex strike. And that's a thing that brings us to this slide, is that Aristophanes, all of his plays move forward on an assumption that's preposterous. One of his plays, the people decide to build a ladder up to the top of Mount Olympus so they can talk to the gods, which echoes the Tower of Babel, right? I already told you there's one with talking frogs in it. All of his plays have a plot that is preposterous and impossible. But good always wins and evil always loses. And he was highly political. He was a complete dove. He didn't like the war. He wanted it to end. And he spent his life basically ridiculing people that wanted the war to continue. He's also known for his beautiful lyrics. He was one of the best poets of his time, maybe period. The problem is that you're just gonna have to take my word for it, because unless you learn to translate ancient Greek, you'll you won't know how beautiful his lyrics were. So, one of the things I want you to think about is that if Aristophanes' plays are built on a assumption that the plot is impossible, then what does that say about a sex strike plot where the women decide that they're going to have a sex strike to end the war? All right, I will stop there, and I will talk to you all in a bit.